Hello and welcome to our first ever Lord of Heroes tier list here on Nyris Gaming. I know there have been several requests for this, and I've noticed that this is one of the highest searched for things on here. So we're finally getting around to it. I apologize it's taken so long. But this first one is going to consist of every effectively in-game currency recruitable hero in the game. Basically how heroes used to be recruited before summoning was introduced. So all of these you can acquire as a free-to-play player. And then the next one we will do is contract heroes, which are also semi-free to play. But without further ado, we are going to start with heroes that you either get for free just for starting or by playing through the campaign. First things first is going to be Water Fram. She is your starting water guardian. You get her just by starting the game. Personal favorite of mine. She did get one slight rework in the past, adding the max HP damage on her burst, which makes her entirely viable as a DPS despite being a guardian. One of her relics gives her stacking attack as well, based on taking damage once per hit, one stack. The only problem with building her like that is her attack is very mediocre, around 1100 at max ascension and level 70. She has quite a hefty health pool. Her defense, however, is a bit mediocre. She has no method of using Pierce, but as far as Guardian abilities are concerned, she has a single target defense down on her 1, an AoE attack down on her burst, and an AoE stun on her 2. The stun has a low chance, the attack down has a decent chance, and the defense down has a really good chance. All of this put together, her being able to tank and to be able to be used as a minor to hefty DPS, being versatile, helping you out through the early stages, and decent in mid to late game as well, will land her at an A. Also keep in mind this is going to be entirely subjective as most tier lists are. So if you like a hero and you want to use them, go right for it. Next up, Light Johan. He's a bit of a pain to nail down as far as what he's supposed to do. He's able to do a decent number of different playstyles. You can build him tanky and have him be a provoker. You can have him be a DPS. Most any heroes will be able to carry you through normal and hard. It's when you start getting into extreme and nightmare and the obelisk and raids that you're going to be looking to more late game capable heroes. Johan is one of those ones who can primarily take you through early game, I would imagine does a decent bit during mid game, and is not the greatest late game. He can single target provoke with his 1, and he has counterattack with warrior gear. His 2 is an AoE defense down, but it has very low chance to trigger. His relics allow him to go both the DPS and the more durable side. One gives him a chance to reduce damage, and the other one gives him a little bit of max health damage, but only at 2 times. So that can be used to help him deal with higher health targets like later game bosses, but not as effectively as other options. And the main problem with him is his stats are kind of terrible. He has workable defense, really low attack, sub 1000 at level 60 no ascension, and sub 7000 health at level 60 no ascension. So if you want him to be higher stat for later game, you're gonna need to ascend him for sure, and even then, it's gonna be a little underwhelming. He is very much the jack of all trades, master of none, because he can do a lot of different debuffs, a different bit of damage. His burst is really low cost and gives him attack and defense up, which is good. But he can do a lot of different things to a mediocre level that a lot of other options can handle at a better level. So I'm going to have him at a C. He has his uses, but he's just outclassed in almost every regard most of the time. Next up is Earth Charlotte. She is going to get some extra points because she is currently the only available Earth Cleric. Earth C2 was a limited time banner, and we don't know if she'll ever come back. And Earth Joshua was part of a limited time Tea Party event, and we don't know when or if he will be coming back. So this is all you got. And she's pretty decent. She is very good to get you through easy and hard and even potentially some extreme. Mainly because of her burst, really solid shielding cleric burst. Good if you get her speed managed to a point where she can block incoming AoE attacks. Her 2 is a great single target heal and fills her burst gauge to max, therefore making it a free action essentially. The only problem is that her shield strength is tied to her max health, and even at level 60 with Ascension 1 that I have her at, she only has 7600 health, so even with another Ascension that'll only bring her to 8300, and bringing her to level 70 will probably bring her to around 9500. So she barely gets close to 10k, and as far as health-based shielders are concerned, she is definitely outclassed in that regard if you've heard me mention Siegfried ever before. Only problem is Siegfried's harder to get. Earth Charlotte you just get right out the gate. Her attack and defense are also sub 1000 at level 60 Ascension 1. So those will barely hop over 1000 each at second Ascension. Very underwhelming stats overall. Sub 100 speed as well. She has 2 relics that are based on attacking, and her only attack abilities are 1. She is far more useful than Johan in the long term though, just because of her ability to block AoEs consistently for a long amount of the game. But in my personal opinion, she's going in B. Decently above average at what she does, but definitely outclassed in A and S tier as far as shield or clerics are concerned. Next up is Earth Schneider. You get him after clearing normal 1-3 in the story. Now he, obviously, most units can damage enough to take out easy and hard targets. Extreme and Nightmare start to become difficult, and bosses require either max HP damage or just absurd amounts of attack or sap. He has sap out of those, and lots of it. He has sap on all 3 of his abilities, and he has a relic that adds a chance for another one at a decently high chance, so he can apply quite a lot of sap stacks, as well as off of his turn if you chain burst him with his ultimately 2 cost burst if you max that out. His attack and defense are kind of atrocious. I have mine at level 60, and he has 880 attack and 774 defense, but he does have a decently hefty health pool at 10,232, which will be made even better at Ascension levels and level 70, but not entirely necessary. You can just build a bunch of health on him, and maybe 1 or 2 defense, and it'll be workable. So he's not going to be great in the damage department, but he can be a decently durable sapper with a lot of chance to deal a lot of sap, and if you absolutely need it, he has another relic that can do Wither. So as far as a character that can transition through early game to mid and late game, he is quite effective in my opinion. I'm going to put him at an A. Fire Mei Ling you get for completing normal 1-6. She is a fire sniper. When the game first started, she used to be much worse, but she got a bit of an update a while back. For 2 is an AoE. It has decently lowest chance, capping at 60% per, but it can do 2 stacks of sap and Wither on an AoE. She has access to sniper gear, so she can fill your burst gauge really effectively. Her burst can give your team a full 3 turns of regeneration if you need extra healing, and that can be chained in at any time you need it. Her 2 relics, if you gain access to them. 1 gives her a chance upon receiving damage to heal quite a decent bit of her health, and her Divine gives you exposed weakness on her attacks, which will increase damage on targets based on the number of debuffs on them. Her main problem, she has better attack and defense than Schneider at level 60, non-ascended, but her health is nearly 2,000 less. She has 5,700 health at level 60, non-ascended, which is utterly atrocious. So she is fragile. You can take more advantage of her defense, but getting higher health pools is going to be difficult. 2 health pieces of equipment will still do a decent bit, just nowhere near as much as other heroes. A lot more snipers can stay far more durable than that. It can do a lot of different things, but not a lot of them terribly well, aka she is outclassed in a lot of them going in later in the game. So we're gonna put her here with Johan. Next we come to Earth Olivia. She will be acquired after logging in for 7 days when you first start the game. Her abilities seem to lean more on the sniper DPS side, with her burst giving her extra turns if it takes out an enemy. However, her 1 and 2 are more leaning towards suppression, with action gauge reduction and speed reduction. So they're to keep you ahead of enemies. This can be useful for a while until you start getting into enemies where this is not applicable anymore. One of her relics does give you a chance to remove buffs on enemies for some extra suppression, and she's a sniper, so she's good for burst gauge. Only problem is she has about 1,000 more health than Fire Mei Ling, and a little over 1,000 in both attack and defense at level 60. So getting her to keep up with the damage output if you're using her as a DPS is going to be difficult in mid to late game. She just does not have the attack or the damage types to handle it, and action gauge reduction is going to be less and less useful as you go on. So good early mid-game sniper, but falls off hard. Gonna put her here. Dark Mikhail you get after completing normal 2-7. I have mine at level 60, and he has 9,800 health, which is far more workable than the previous few. He has a little over 1,000 attack, which is a bit on the low side, but he has quite dismal defense at 774. If you want to use him late game, he is definitely going to be needing Ascension and or level 70. However, he has speed scaling for his damage on his 1 and 2, and his 2 ups his speed. His burst is an AoE, has a very high chance at 90% to reduce the enemy's action gauges, and if it crits, it ignores defense, so that gives him some pierce even though he is a sniper and doesn't have access to that normally. So he is set up to be a fast attacker, and he has a crit rate passive skill, so you have to build less of that. And one of his relics gives him access to blitzing, and that is upon attacking, so every single one of his abilities will have a max 55% chance to trigger his 2, including his 2. You can fire 2 2s off in rapid succession if that triggers. Can do decent as a sub DPS and generates burst gauge because he is a sniper. Only thing he is missing is higher attack and max HP damage as a DPS, and his burst does not share the speed scaling that his 1 and 2 do, unfortunately. But overall, solid sub DPS sniper unit, and can transition into mid to late game far better than the other previous 2. I'm going to put him here. Moving on to Fire Zaira. She is acquired by completing normal Rodan. She is a Fire Guardian. She has a bunch of debuffs, but they're all not the most effective except for her burst, because her 1 and 2 only have a 60% chance, even though the 1 is a single target, so they're not the most reliable. Her burst, however, is a 90% chance to reduce a single target's defense for 30 turns, and is only a 2-cost burst. Her burst is her primary ability that you would use her for. She also has access to the Bulwark Guardian equipment set to reduce the damage your team takes. Me personally, I used her as my main DPS for most of normal, because normal can be DPS'd by pretty much anyone. She has minorly subpar health at level 60 at 8800, so even Mikhail has higher than her as a sniper. She has terrible attack at 847. The only problem is she doesn't have much going for her other than her burst. Her relics do allow her access to buff removal on enemies and resistance up for allies if you get a hold of them, so this could help you in early game debuff avoidance, but there will be better options for that usually. So in conclusion, solid single target defense breaker and damage reduction for the team with Bulwark, but that's about it. Other Guardians will be better. Is going in C. Water Helga, acquired at normal 510. She is your first heavily AoE striker character. Your first striker character in general, actually. She has self-heal on her 1, her 2, and her 3 are both AoE and deal sap stacks. She, even built a little bit right, can easily carry you through normal and hard. She has atrociously low health. Think Mei Ling levels. I have mine at level 60 and Ascension 1, and she still only has 6600. She does break 1000 in the defense category though, and she has a decent attack at 1200, so she can carry that into later game far more effectively. With Ascension at level 70, she should have 14 or 1500 attack, which is about what middle to high DPSs in late game have. There are some that get into 2000 territory. We will get to that later. And one of her relics is very similar to Schneider's, which gives her extra chance to inflict another stack of sap on all of her abilities. So it adds sap onto her 1, which doesn't have it normally. So you can transition her late game into either an AoE DPS, although she doesn't have max health damage. She does have access to Pierce being a striker, which will add extra damage ignoring defense. Or you can build her more beefy with sap. So she has 2 very viable, more versatile options for late game. She's going to be outclassed especially by her younger version as far as AoE and boss killing damage is concerned, but she is still very useful in a couple of different ways. And she does what she does as effectively as a lot of them. So she is going to be our first S tier. Next we get to Earth Astrid, another Earth Striker. You acquire her after completing normal 7-3. Keep in mind though that Astrid, like all of her forms, has no AoE. She is always purely single target. However, being a sniper, she is very built to be a DPS. She has a passive attack skill. Her 1 is like Earth Olivia's Burst, in which it gives her an extra turn if she takes out an enemy using it. Her 2 has a 100% chance to remove 2 buffs on a target, so far more effective than the ones we've seen so far. This can become very useful later when you encounter things like thorns or counterattack, or even invincibility occasionally. And her Burst, despite being a sniper, ignores defense, so that gives her access to some pierce, and it is a 2-cost burst. Her main problem stat-wise is her defense. It's only 774 at level 60, but she has over 1,000 attack and 9,500 health, so with Ascensions and level 70 can go even higher and more effective than that. One of her relics gives her access to attack up as a buff whenever she attacks, which is all 3 of her abilities, and her other relic can give her fortitude when she receives damage, which will prevent her from dying. Main problem as a DPS in late game is she has no max health damage, so she will not be the greatest against bosses or higher health targets. So she can be good through mid game, and the lack of AoE is going to be a struggle. You need AoE people to clear the early waves until you get to a boss. But I put her at a bit better than Earth Olivia in this case, so she's going in B. Okay, now we're going to get into heroes that cost crystals. Next we have our first bird man, Earth Dhurahan. He is going to cost 3,000 crystals. He is an Earth Guardian. His 1 and 2 are almost identical, so they're a bit redundant. They both have a chance to stun, and if they don't stun, they provoke instead. So at least he has guaranteed chance to trigger a crowd control effect if they don't resist it. He is also purely single target, so keep that in mind. Being a Guardian, he does not have access to counterattack, so he cannot keep the provocation up unless you have someone else that can give counterattack to him. He has a pretty solid health pool, but his other 2 stats are kind of mediocre to bad. And this is going to be his main problem, is he can reduce the action gauge of a target and stun or provoke a single target. And that is the extent of his abilities. He has no relics as of currently. He is just a healthy Guardian that has access to Bulwark and can provoke occasionally. So he has very little utility, and there are immensely more options that can do it better. So he is going to be our first D tier. Next is Dark Schneider. He is going to cost 6,000 crystals, so take a little bit more time than some of the other crystal heroes. He has very decently well-rounded stats overall, but he could use Ascension because I have mine at level 50 at 6-star with Ascension 2, and he's just broken 1,000 attack and defense and 9,500 health, so not the greatest without Ascension. A little bit reliant on that. He is a Dark Warrior. His 1 is a single target attack and increases his speed, so it's a bit underwhelming for his counterattack ability, but it will keep his speed up pretty periodically. His 2 is his primary source of damage, as it is a every other turn AoE max health based damage attack, and his burst is a 2-cost burst that ups his crit rate and crit damage. So you can string that in with a chain burst to get those buffs on him. And also, one of his relics gives him access to blitzing. So that burst could trigger his 2, which is his damage source, and allow all of his abilities to fire off his damage source. The only problem he encounters as a DPS warrior is he does not have access to any pierce. So high defense targets are going to be a struggle for him, and his only source of damage is AoE, so it's going to be a little bit less on single targets. However, he can transition easily into late game as an AoE dark sub DPS if you need an extra little bit of damage in the silenced rates, for example. He is going to go up here in A. Next up is Fire Dhurahan. He is going to cost 3,000 crystals, so same as his Earth counterpart. There is something to note as well. There are a lot of heroes in this game, and I do not have anywhere near all of them fully built, so a lot of this is going to be speculation on my part on heroes that I have at lower level, so take that all with a grain of salt. Best I can figure from his stats, his defense is going to be mediocre to bad at later levels, but his health is going to be decently solid, and an alright attack, nothing to get excited about. He can provoke like his Earth counterpart, but his chance to do so on his 1 is only a maximum of 55%. So this will be his counterattack ability, but it's decently low chance, especially for a single target. Other options are immensely better. including one on this list. Decently high chance with his 2 to increase the duration of a debuff on a target, and it gets up to 2 of them. And unlike his Earth counterpart, his burst is an AoE, which will have a very high chance at 90% to remove a single buff off of the enemies he hits. His burst also gives him Thorns, which is one of the most underwhelming buffs on player characters there can be, because in order for Thorns to do any significant amount of damage, the character would need to take so much damage that they would die. So it is not terribly effective. There are only 2 or 3 characters in the entire game that have that buff. 2 of them are on this list, one of them immensely better than the other. And with Dhurahan here, if you really need to remove buffs on an enemy, you can use his burst for that. His 2 extending debuffs on enemies can be useful, but there is another character on this list that is immensely better at that. And other than that, that's all he's really good for. There's far better provokers, there's far better debuff extenders. There might not be all that better free-to-play buff removers, but there are definitely those in existence, so he's going to sit with his Earth version down here at D as well. Don't worry, the Dhurahans get better from here on out. Only problem is that the best one was paid only at one point and hasn't been available since, sadly. But moving on, now we get to Fire Helga. Immensely not as exciting as Water Helga. She is a fire warrior. I do not have her heavily leveled at the moment. Best I can speculate on her stats, she has mediocre health and decent to alright attack and defense. Her counterattack ability with her 1 has a very high chance to reduce the target's attack power at 80%. Her 2 is an AoE defense down, which is always nice to have. Her burst is an AoE stun, similar to Water Fram, although her stun chance is higher than her defense down chance, and her defense down chance is only at 50%. So as far as AoE defense downs are concerned, there are far better options, which we will also get to later. She is definitely built for debuffs and not damage. One of her relics even extends the duration of debuffs on the targets, which will be any of her attacks, including her AoEs. So she has a lane, and she does decently in it, but there are better options. If you need an earlier 3000 crystal option for AoE defense down, among other things, then she is a decent choice. Just going into later, she is going to get outclassed in every way. Going here in C. Now we get to Water Astrid. She is going to cost 6,000 crystals, and as far as lanes are concerned, she has a very specific one, and that is preventing a single target from doing literally anything. Her burst is going to be a single target attack that will completely deplete the target's action gauge, 100%. This is really great for a lot of early game bosses, even 1 or 2 in extreme, and a lot in the early stages of the obelisk. The only problem with it is that once you get into later games and bosses are immune to CC, then it becomes completely useless. She has a really solid health pool, surpassing 10,000. She has very low attack, so she's not going to be the greatest in that regard, and she has abysmal defense, only getting around 700 at level 60. Her 2 does give her a counterattack buff, which will allow her to fire off her 1, which can stun and remove buffs off of enemies, so she does have her utilities beyond her burst. She has no AoE like all Astrids, however. One of her relics does give her access to provocation, but without AoE, having her lock down an entire field of enemies is not the easiest of tasks, and there are much more effective options available. However, for a good 2/3 of the game, if you want to have her preventing bosses from ever taking action, as long as they are the kind that are not immune to CC, she is going to be your go-to. Solid early to mid game, falls off hard on late game, but has her uses for a lot of areas, so we are going to put her in B. Next up is going to be Water Schneider. He is a water striker. He costs 3,000 crystals. He's going to have decently low health, decent attack, and alright defense. He's going to be a little bit of an oddity, because his 1 removes buffs from enemies. It can do up to 2 effects removed. His 2 is an AoE action gauge reduction, and his burst is kind of there to fill his action gauge to full, so he can get his turn faster. He's definitely going to struggle in the damage department when it comes to later game, with no max HP damage on anything, and a lot of his abilities abilities not helping him deal damage, even though he is a striker. His 2 relics that he has access to will give buffs to other allies. These include leech and crit damage increase. So he is very much a striker with a sniper's kit. It is very weird. He can do a lot of random things, but damage is not one of the primary ones of them. It would be better if he was a sniper with access to sniper gear, so he could give burst gauge as well as giving all of these buffs, because he has pierce with his gear, but he can't really make the most use of that with how his kit works, and therefore gets outclassed in pretty much every way. So he's going to be another D tier. Onward to Earth Mei Ling. She is an Earth striker. She costs 3,000 crystals, and from the beginning of the game, she has been one of those characters to primarily be used in PvP, and even more so these days. Her main problem is she has absurdly low health, just like her fire counterpart, so she is very fragile. She has far better defense though. She has decently high attack, so she can do a bit of damage. However, her abilities are not geared toward late game damage, they're more geared toward early and mid game, so they can't be used there effectively. Her burst applies sap stacks up to 3, but it is at a very low 40%, so immensely better options for sap. Her 2 is primarily what you're going to go for as far as extra utility in PvP, along with one other thing, which is an action gauge boost of 20% on a striker, which is strange. That is normally on guardians and warriors, sometimes clerics. And her primary function in PvP these days is on her refined relic, which gives her a chance on the start of a round to instantly petrify each enemy, capping at a whopping 80% respectively on each enemy. So you can instantly crowd control them without doing anything. This can be good in wave-based levels as well. So she does have her uses, just not the primary one you would think of with a striker. She has far more utility, but the utility she does have is very effective in its niche uses. Mostly glass, less of the cannon. So for her ability to do a couple things really, really well, but a lot of things not the greatest, she's going to land in a middling B. Great if you want her for PvP, not the greatest if you want her for PvE content, especially later on. Moving on now to Dark 9. He is going to be acquired after completing Hard 8-5 and a cost of 6,000 crystals. He is going to be one of the better snipers and sap appliers in the game. His 1 has an 80% chance to apply 1 stack of sap. His 2 is an AoE that has 80% chance to apply 2 stacks of sap. Only downside with that one is it is a 4-turn cooldown at max rank, so it takes a while to come back up. His burst is also a 4 cost and does not reduce at all, so that's a bit of a downside, but it has a 85% chance to extend the duration of one of the oldest buffs on a target, and it is AoE, so you can apply a bunch of sap and keep it going. He has decent attack, but he is not really designed for that. Things he is designed for, unfortunately, are a bit mediocre and lacking. His health and defense, even at level 60 in Ascension 1, are 8,500 and 924. They can be worked with, especially since you can focus on them, given you don't need to build him for attack all that much, because he is purely for sap, and he is very good at it. One of the best free-to-play sap options in the game, only outclassed by 1 or 2 other options, one of which will be in the next tier list video, specifically Water Lucilicca. So he is going to be our next S tier. He has a job and he does it really well, and he can also provide burst gauge because he's a sniper. Next up is Water Olivia, available for 6,000 crystals. She is a water sniper. She is outclassed on her 2 as far as an AoE defense down is concerned, but she is one of the reasons that she is much better than Fire Helga, because her 2 is an AoE 3-turn cooldown, 70% chance of reducing defense for 2 turns, so it's a very solid 2 ability to keep your DPS as high as possible. One of her relics also gives her a chance to reduce the cooldown of it when she attacks, which is all of her abilities. The other relic allows her to pocket boost your ally with the highest attack on your team, get them going faster. Even though she is a sniper, she is more geared towards DPS. Her 1 heals her if it's a crit, and her burst gets down to an easy 2 cost at max rank and gives her increased attack power for 3 turns. Only problem in the damage category is that she lacks pierce and max HP damage. However, with mine at Ascension 1 and level 60, she has 1100 attack, just barely over 10,000 health. Her defense is a little lacking at 838, but the other 2 stats are really usable. At level 60 and Ascension 2, they'll be even more usable, so she is a solid sub-DPS sniper with good AoE defense down. You need a little bit more water damage, so she's going on A tier. Next up is poor little Water Charlotte. She's better than she used to be, but she's still not terribly great. She gains extra points for being a jumping off point to getting Fire Vanessa. She is a prerequisite. She herself costs 3,000 crystals. She is a water cleric. She generates shields and or heals on all of her abilities. The only problem with all of these is they are based on attack as a cleric, and her attack is one of her worst stats. She has far better health, far more workable, aiming towards more of the 9,000, 10,000 range at level 60. So she's not fragile for sure, but clerics mostly need to build health and defense to stay alive to be able to heal people. But if you build purely that, you're going to be sacrificing all of your shield and heal power. So the primary way to go about it would be to build sub-stats as attack, which will require a more difficult build path. One thing she does have going for her is she is an easy option for debuff cleansing. She can only remove one effect, but it is on her burst and it only costs 2, and she is one of the only free-to-play options for this. Most debuff cleansing options or immunity options these days are in the summon system or from paid-only heroes. One of her relics also allows you access to Wither on her 1, which can be nice against a few enemies that are annoying in the campaign that have healing. So having that as a free-to-play option is nice, although there are a couple more free-to-play options that have this and aren't tied to relics. So her 1 free-to-play debuff use and her being a prerequisite to Fire Vanessa is going to land her not quite in D tier, but in C tier, mainly for the few things she offers that you cannot get anywhere else. Other than that, she is by far not the best cleric option. Next up is going to be our last crystal hero with Water Vanessa. She's going to cost 6k crystals. You're definitely going to want to get her. She is a water cleric. She's going to make Water Charlotte pale in comparison. Her main problem is that her 1 and her 2 are based on either damage dealt or attack, similar things, but her 2 is a 3-turn cooldown leech buff to all the team for 3 turns, so she can keep it up constantly. It also heals, but that's based on her attack power. Her burst is what she's primarily recruited for, which is a 3-cost resurrection of the entire team, so if they are dead they come back. They get healed based on her defense as well, so she does have some defense scaled healing. Her 1 can do a little damage and heal her based on the damage dealt, but that's not the most useful ever. Her burst is really useful to 3-star stages all the way through late game in almost every scenario. You can be built very durable, although her stats are very, very low. Mine is at level 60 and Ascension 2. She just barely broke 9,000 health and just barely broke 1,000 defense. She is very level and Ascension dependent. She is very useful to have around, especially in tandem with her fire counterpart, and she's also a prerequisite for a later hero. She is going to go straight up into S tier, despite having some underwhelming bits. The things that she does have, she does very well, and she's one of the few in the entire game that can do them. Very easy to get and very helpful in that regard. Now we're going to get into renown heroes, a bit harder of a thing to farm than crystals. Next up is Dark Dhurahan. He is going to cost 1 million renown, so he's going to be a bit on the pricier side, although on the lower end of the pricier side, as you will see. He is a dark warrior. He is purely single target, and he is one of the few characters who can do Petrify that he specifically synergizes off of, because his 1 and 3 gain extra damage against petrified targets. He has 0 AoE, unfortunately. His 1 is where his petrification comes from, so that is his counterattack ability. Sadly, petrified targets can't attack him to counterattack them with boosted damage against petrify, so that doesn't work quite well. His 2 will self-heal based on damage and give him a crit rate increase. He has pretty good attack and decent defense, but his health is a bit on the low side. He can be a good single target DPS for a good while. The only problem is that his bonus damage against petrified targets is going to become useless late game as soon as you start encountering crowd control immune bosses and the like. So it can be good for a while, so not quite D like his other counterparts, but we're gonna put him in C. He can synergize quite well with Buryu if you have him, as Buryu has petrify on his 1. Only problem is Buryu can outdamage him pretty much any day in every way, and he has an AoE. Next up is Fire Joshua. You're going to need to occupy normal Gallus East and spend 500 100,000 renown, so cheaper than Dhurahan. He is in a very similar situation to Schneider though, because he is another striker with a sniper kit, but he can be quite the effective pocket supporter for your main DPS. His 1 is a single target action gauge reduction. His 2 is the primary buffer for your DPS, as it is a 3-turn ability that will increase the attack power of the target for 3 turns and grant them invincibility for 1 turn. They can use that to block attacks against your main DPS so they don't die. And his burst is going to be a 2-cost 90% chance to attack and defense down on a single target to help your DPS do more to them. It also ignores resistance, so that 90% chance is all you have to worry about. His relics give you even more utility. His refined actually helps you with the burst gauge by increasing the amount he gains to counteract the fact that he is not a sniper, even though he acts like one. And his divine will give you scald to help your fire teams do more damage against targets, so he can apply that to enemies, albeit he has no AoE. And then despite the fact that he is highly utility based, he has mediocre health and defense and decent attack. So he has the stat build of a striker as well, but the kit of a sniper. So he can be useful for a good while, or if you're trying to build a full fire team, he can help your fire DPS out. There are going to be better options later, but he does what he does decently well. He's just a bit disjointed, just like Schneider, but far more effective than Schneider. So he's going in B. Next up is Dark Solphi, with the hefty cost of 1 million renown and having completed the 50th floor of the obelisk, so the hardest one and final one. Not an easy task. She is a Dark Guardian, although she is built to be a DPS. A lot of disjointed characters here trying to break the mold. All of her abilities are going to scale with speed, which can be very useful, so she can go really fast and still get the damage from it, albeit that makes building her harder because you're going to need a lot of speed substats. So it is a blessing and a curse. Her 1 and her 3 both ignore defense, so that helps her do more damage despite being a guardian. And her divine relic gives her a chance to grant herself pierce whenever she attacks, which is all of her abilities. So she gets even more extra damage that ignores defense. This might be a bit reliant on that to do higher amounts of damage. From what I saw when she first came out, her damage was a bit mediocre. Looking at what she is currently, she's going to have pretty decent stats overall in all 3 categories, but attack is definitely on the lower end of the 3, so a mix of speed and attack is going to be a bit more necessary, again making her hard to build. She does also inflict confusion on herself with her burst until you get it to max rank, which can cause her to attack your team, which is never good. Her 2 gives her counterattack, so whenever she gets hit she will be firing off her 1, which will, if it crits, action gauge boost your team. Synergistic utility there. Overall she can be a decent between sub and main DPS with a lot of AoE. She's just really hard to get, really hard to build properly, and ultimately is not going to do quite as much damage as others. She does have a lot of defense ignore, but she does not have any max HP damage, so late game she's going to struggle. She's not going to be really much around for early game because of what you have to do to get her, so we're going to put her into a C, slightly leaning B tier. Next up is Fire Aslan. He is going to cost a hefty 3 million renown, and you have to be level 25, your lord, to purchase him. He's a fire guardian, and he is one of many action gauge boosters in the game, albeit his is on the weaker side compared to most. Most action gauge boosters have 2-turn 40 to 45% action gauge boosts. His is only going to be a 3-turn cooldown for 35%, but as far as other utility is concerned, his 1 will give himself and your highest attack ally an attack up buff, and his burst only costs 2 and has an 80% chance to inflict wither, like we mentioned before with Water Charlotte, so it is better than hers and isn't relic dependent. He also has very balanced stats overall, all very middling to decent, so they're all workable but not the best. So he can be durable, and then you can build him for speed so you can action gauge more frequently. A very good middle of the road action gauge and pocket supporty guardian. Also can be built with bulwark because of being a guardian for more damage reduction. So he is going to go into A tier. Next up is going to be Dark Helga. You are going to need to complete Gallus East hard and spend 300,000 renown. She is a dark warrior. She's a bit of a weird one. She is one of the few, if not only, heroes in the game with extra turns she can gain, that she is not limited to only one extra turn. Her text reads, more than one extra turn can be gained in a row, and she gains an extra turn if anything dies to her 1 or her burst, and her burst ignores defense, so she does not have to worry about Pierce for that. Easy and hard enemies will probably be able to be soloed by her with just a bit of durability and attack, because she will take turns non-stop taking out each enemy with her 1 and burst. She will struggle late game because she has no max HP damage unless you build her full attack, crit, and crit damage. She might do decently against basic enemies in the waves, but bosses she will struggle hard with. Her 2 is an AoE 60% resistance reduction, and that is the main problem with her. Is that's it. That's her entire kit. She's very simplistic and doesn't offer much in way of extra utility, extra damage, team assistance, self-assistance. She can just hit decently hard and hit a lot before the enemy can, until late game where that becomes less and less viable to one-shot things without high damage bursts. Her health and attack are decent. Her defense is a bit on the low side. One of her relics gives her attack up, and another one can, if she crits, increase her action gauge, which is not really necessary if she's built the way she's meant to just be continually taking turns. Yeah, she just doesn't do much beyond that. She can do one thing and do it really well, and it's funny to watch as you take out one enemy after another and they just have to stand there and watch, but then she falls off kind of hard, going in a decent middling B tier. Other better Helgas are available. Next we come to Water Rashad. He is going to cost a hefty 3 million renown, and he is a water warrior. His counter-attack ability with his 1 is going to reduce his 2's cooldown by 1 turn and have a 80% chance to reduce the target's damage they deal for 2 turns, so a very good counter-attack ability for his warrior gear. His 2 is going to be a team-wide action gauge boost and increase attack power, only for 1 turn though, and the cooldown only gets down to 4 turns, but again with his 1 that can be reduced even further if he gets hit and counterattacks. The action gauge boost is only going to be 30%, so it's not as good as others, but he is primarily there for a water AoE DPS, so having this is just a bonus. And his burst is going to be a 3 cost AoE max health damage attack, the full 5 times. He has a crit chance skill, so you have to build less of it. Only thing he's going to struggle with comparatively to other units like Dragon Knight Helga is he does not have access to Pierce. He has no relics. His health and attack are on the decent to alright side, nowhere near as high as Dragon Knight Helga gets, and his defense is mediocre to so he can be a good AoE water DPS, but there are better options. But he also has the utility of being a minor team action gauge booster, so he is going to go into A tier. Moving on now to Earth Laphlaes, one of my personal favorites that I use all the time. He is going to cost a hefty 3 million renown, however, and you have to occupy hard Lumisade. He is an Earth warrior, definitely suited to being an AoE DPS. His counterattack ability is going to have a chance to stun the target, and it gives him a leech buff so he can self-heal. His 2 is kind of underwhelming, but it's just an extra attack effectively because it fills his action gauge to full. His burst is going to be an AoE 3 cost max health based damage attack, and is going to increase his defense for 2 turns, make him more durable. He has a crit chance skill to make it so you have to build less of that. His refined relic gives him pierce on his attacks. I was trying to figure out why he doesn't quite do as much damage as others, because he does have that pierce damage and he has the max health damage. I have at Ascension 2 level 70, so the max of the max you can get, and even then he's only hit 12,000 health and 1600 in defense and attack. So without level 70 and without Ascensions, his stats are not going to be the greatest comparatively to other DPSs, so you can be a bit dependent on those, but if you do use those, he can be very, very helpful. He's very good at being a durable, sometimes crowd controlling, AoE heavy damage dealer, especially in those obelisk floors where you're required to use a single unit that is Earth. He can clear those solo quite effectively if built properly, and is usable in all sorts of late game content. A good one to pick up if you're looking to pick up one of the higher cost renown heroes. He's going straight up to S tier. Not as good comparatively as he used to be in the olden days before other options became available, but he's still very, very usable. Next up is another one of my personal favorites since she came out, Light Solphi. She is is going to cost another 3 million renown. You also have to complete normal Gallus East. Her main draw is she's going to have one of the strongest AoE defense downs in the game. Going to be a hefty 4-turn cooldown, but it's going to apply a 3-turn defense down at 80%, which is very high for an AoE. And her 1 and her burst are going to get 100% increased damage against targets that have reduced defense. Her burst is a 3 cost that applies shock, albeit at a 60% rate, and it is AoE. Her 1 gives her stacking attack up to a max of 105% increase that stays until a wave ends, and that is her counterattack ability as a light warrior. Her main struggle, mine is at level 60 Ascension 2, and she only has 10,400 health, 1,200 attack, and 1,100 defense. So she is very Ascension and level dependent. For late game, she will easily carry you through early to mid game as an AoE DPS, but late game her struggle is her low stats, because even if I get her to level 70, she's going to have these stats of a DPS that would have it at level 60 normally as far as good late game DPSs are concerned. And she also lacks max HP based damage, but her burst does ignore defense, so she's just on the cusp of being really good in S tier if she had max HP damage on her burst and a bit higher attack. She's just not quite there, and there's one other option that's a bit better for applying shock, but he is paid only and has not been available for a while, so she is going to go into A tier. Next up is going to be Fire Astrid. Water Vanessa is going to be a prerequisite for her, and she's going to cost 1 million renown after that. She has pretty decent to good attack, usable defense, but her health is quite abysmal at level 60, only just under 7,000. She's going to be Glass Cannon, as Astrids tend to be, apart from Water Astrid. She's going to be a speed scaling DPS, so all of her abilities will increase in damage based on her speed, which, as we said, is a blessing and a curse. Means you can build her really fast, but building her like that is going to be more difficult to get the substats that you need. Her 2 will increase her speed further with that buff. Her burst is only going to cost 2. All of her abilities are almost identical. They're just single target, attack selected enemy, increased damage based on user speed, although with her 2 with the speed increase. Her Divine Relic is also going to give her access to Blitz, which will keep that speed up more frequently, given she can blitz off of any of her abilities with that relic. Only problem, like all Astrids, she has no AoE. She has Pierce as a striker, but she has no max HP based damage, so she can be really good at hitting really hard and really fast single targets for a good long while. She's just going to struggle with later game higher health targets, and she is very fragile, so decently good, not the greatest, and hard to build, going right in B tier. Next up is going to be another Fire Striker, Fire Lucilicca. You're going to need to be level 20 and pay 3 million renown, so really expensive. She, like Fire Astrid, is a single target DPS, no AoE whatsoever. Her 1 is going to give her extra action gauge, so he recovers a bit of what she uses and goes a bit faster. Problem with her 2 is it does a decent bit of damage, but the extra damage it does is based on how much health she's missing. So to maximize it, she needs to be low on health, which is not good for a DPS. Her burst is a really good single target, max health based damage attack, and she has access to Pierce as a striker. Only problem with her, weirdly, is that even at level 60 and Ascension 2, she only has 1,368 attack, which is really low for someone that high in levels. Decent defense at 1,100 and just over 10,000 health, so she's more durable than most DPSs. Like with a lot of others, she has a lane. She stays in it, doesn't do much else, but is really good at it. Basically, she's good at taking out Earth bosses, and that's it. But she's really good at it. So she's going to go into A tier, a good one to pick up for your burst slot in the Earth Alliance raid. One of the best options you can choose as a free-to-play. Moving on to yet another Fire Striker is going to be Fire Schneider. He's only going to cost 100,000 renown, but there is good reason for that. He is very straightforward. All of his abilities are attack and heal based on damage. Only thing that's different is his 2 is an AoE. All identical. Very simplistic. So you don't have to worry about healing him as much, unless there's large amounts of damage coming in. Then you might need shielding. One of his relics can give him fortitude, and another one can increase his action gauge when he hits. His main problem is he offers not much beyond I hit things and heal off of it. He has decently good attack, but his health and defense are a bit mediocre. So another glass cannon, he's not going to have a ton of health to heal. There's just not a lot to work with here. And he doesn't have max health damage, so bosses are going to be harder later on. Better options available, but going to be a bit more useful and sustainable as a striker than his water counterpart, so he's going to go in C. Now, the olden time darling of early days of Lord of Heroes, Light Olivia. She is a light striker, and she costs a whopping 5 million renown. She is the second highest cost renown hero in the game, that has one strike against her. Mine personally, at level 60 in Ascension 2, has 1500 attack, so a good hefty bit there. She still hasn't broken 10k health, so a bit fragile there, and not over 1000 defense. Early to mid games, she should be fine. Late game, it's going to be a bit more of a struggle to keep her alive. Her 1 does heal her, however, based on damage dealt, and increase her attack power. It's also going to be her counter attack ability from her 2, which is an AoE 60% chance to provoke enemies, and grants her counter attack for 1 turn. So it forces them to hit her, and she gets to retaliate as well. Perfect synergy there. It's also on a 3-turn cooldown. Her burst is a 3-cost burst that ignores defense, attacks a single target, fills her action gauge to 100%, so she gets to attack in rapid succession. Oftentimes when she's being autoplayed, she fires off a couple in a row. Also gives her thorns, which we talked about earlier, which is very useless on her. It's supposed to synergize with her provocation, so they're hitting her with thorns as well. Just if they're doing enough damage for that to matter, it's going to kill her. So it might as well not be there. She does get a bit more health with one of her passive skills, and her Divine Relic is going to, when she gets hit, give her a chance to increase her attack power, stacking up to 5 times and lasting for the wave, so she gets even more damage. Overall, she is a very solid light DPS. The only thing she's lacking is max health damage, but with the high enough attack and the defense ignore and the upping of attack and the utility with her provocation and counterattack, she can get a lot of hits in that hit decently hard despite not having the max HP. Her main problem is her cost. Despite all that, she is going to go up here with the S tiers. Very usable in a lot of situations. Only struggles a bit with a decent amount of late game content, but can handle a lot of it as well. Next up is Light Mei Ling. She is a light sniper, and you have to clear floor 25 of the obelisk and pay 700,000 renown. Fitting that you have to do the obelisk for her because she can be quite helpful in some stages. I don't know about these days, but there have been times where the requirement for some stages is don't bring a cleric. She is a sniper, but she has very cleric-y abilities. Her 1 is going to attack an enemy and heal the team for a percentage of their health, capping at 20%. Her 2 is going to grant health regeneration to the team for even more healing. Main problem with this is it's a 4-turn cooldown and the regen only lasts 2 turns. Her burst is the weird one because it's a 3 cost that just does AoE damage and gives her an extra turn if an enemy dies. Although the way she is meant to be built, that is not going to be happening very frequently. And another weird thing is she has a crit rate passive for all the damage she's not going to be doing. She has mediocre attack, somewhat subpar defense, and decent health. One of her relics, the Divine one, is going to give her a chance to trigger Flurry so she can fire off her healing one more frequently. And her Refined is going to action gauge boost light elemental enemies so she can be quite at home in a light comp. She also has access to sniper gear to increase your burst gauge. Effective in niche cases where you need extra healing or you can't use a healer, although that second one is not very frequent. But she does an alright job of what she's here to do, but in most cases she's not going to be needed, so she's going to be in a middling B tier. Next up is going to be Dark Joshua. He is going to be 1 million renown, and you're going to have to occupy East Gallus on hard. He is currently the only free-to-play Dark Cleric. The only other ones are Dark Mei Ling and Dark Vanessa. Vanessa is currently a summon banner, and Dark Mei Ling, I don't remember if she is on Link Summon. If not, she is currently not available at all. So he is your only free-to-play option without summon. He has very, very, very good utility with his 2, which is a 2-turn cooldown, fully action gauge boost to 100%, and remove all debuffs on a selected target. Him being in your burst slot in Alliance raids is quite useful to keep your DPS making very frequent turns, and in burst slot because his burst can do up to 3 sap stacks. His 1 can also inflict a stack of sap, so he can be decent against bosses in that regard, despite being a cleric. The weird thing with him is that apart from the cleric gear healing, he can heal on his 1 and 3, but the healing is based on damage dealt and only if he crits. So you primarily want to build him for speed to action gauge boost your DPS, and as a cleric you want to keep him durable, but you also want him to heal, so you have to build crit on him and at least a little bit of damage to make it heal enough to be worthwhile. So it's a bit unsynergistic in that regard, but the utility you get out of his 2 is just immense and very helpful in a lot of cases. So he's going to go right here. Next up is going to be another cleric, but Fire Vanessa. You're going to need to have recruited Water Charlotte and spend 500,000 renown, one of the primary uses for Water Charlotte. Fire Vanessa is currently the only free-to-play fire cleric in the game, so she is nice to have around for a fire team. If nothing else, to just have that option available. She's also very, very, very good. She has a very hefty health pool, so she can be built durable, as a cleric should be. Her defense is a bit subpar, though. Her 2 is going to be a 3-turn defense-based heal to all allies and increase their defense for 3 turns, so she can keep defense up constantly. Her main draw is her burst, which is a 3-cost heal to all allies based on her maximum health, which is really good, and also makes them invincible for 1 turn. Set up her speed right, she can block incoming AoE attacks, which happen very frequently throughout the campaign. She is effectively a fire version of Earth Charlotte that is immensely better, because you don't have to worry about if the shield is strong enough. They are straight up invincible and cannot receive damage. You pair her in tandem with her water version with her res and leech, and your team becomes nigh unkillable. The main problem with her is her low defense and the fact that her 1 exists. Her 1 basically does nothing. It attacks a selected enemy and the damage increases based on her defense. This is effectively useless apart from gaining a bit of burst gauge. It's a bit silly, sadly. She also doesn't have any relics, just like her water counterpart, so that's another downside, but that's not as frequently used early to mid game. But with all that said, her synergy with her water, her invincibility burst, her solid defensive and healing 2 will land her in S tier alongside her water counterpart. As a matter of fact, there we go. Next up, Dark Aslan. The only commander on this list, because he is the only commander that is not tied to a summon banner. The only problem is he is tied to a cost of a whopping 10 million renown, double the cost of Light Olivia. Is he worth it? The primary reason you would get Dark Aslan is to have a commander and for his 2, which is better than it was on launch. It was terrible on launch with like a 4 or 5 turn cooldown. Now it is a 3 turn cooldown, which will target the ally with the highest attack power if he is being controlled by the AI. It will fully heal them, fully boost their action gauge so they get a turn immediately in most scenarios, and it will resurrect them. So you build him speedy to action gauge boost your DPS and keep them alive even through death. Pair him with the likes of Waterlin, and you can keep this up every other turn. You build him durable with his decently solid health pool and decently solid defense. His 1 will single target reduce the action gauge of the target, and his burst will cost 2 and will have a 70% chance to reduce the single target attack power and defense for 2 turns, ignoring resistance, very similar to Fire Joshua. He will also come with a commander ability, as all commanders do, that will give him a chance to remove 1 debuff from each ally on the start of his turn in the Alliance raid. I would give him higher because his 2 is very strong. The only problem is without the res, you can get that in the form of Dark Joshua at immensely cheaper, and he's just absurdly expensive to get and takes a long time to save up for, and he's not really worth it for all of that effort. So he's going in a B tier. Next up is Fire Fram, another personal favorite. She is a Fire Guardian, and the way you get her is unfortunately the Christmas login event. You get her full for free for logging in for a certain number of days during Christmas, and that is the only way. That is her main problem, is if you don't have her, you have to wait till Christmas every year. So getting her is a bit obnoxious, even though it's free. However, she is very good at what she does. She is a provoker, and she can keep targets provoked and locked down. She has a very hefty health pool and decent defense. All of her abilities damage scales with her defense. Her 1 is a single target attack that has an 80% provocation chance. Her 2 is a 3-turn cooldown AoE 60% chance to provoke enemies for 1 turn, 50% chance to reduce their action gauges by 20%, and it grants her Fury of the Stalwart, which increases her defense by 3% for every 5% of health lost. And then to top it all off, she has a 3-cost burst, which is AoE, ups the defense of all of your teammates for 1 turn, and gives her a counterattack for 2 turns. She is very good at keeping enemies in line, including those bosses in the obelisk later on that are immune to CC except for cooldown reduction and provocation. Every instance that provocation is useful, she can handle it quite effectively. Only problem comes when the situation does not call for that, which is in a lot of boss scenarios, so that will keep her out of S tier, but definitely a solid A tier. Also not in S tier because of the absurd wait time to get her. We're out of renowned heroes and into the more obscure way to get heroes, for these next 2 at least. Water 9 and Earth Zaira are both in the Alliance Raid shop. They both cost quite a hefty sum, Zaira more. Water 9 costs 150,000 Alliance Raid credits. He is a water warrior. His counterattack ability will grant him a shield based on his attack power. His 2 is a 4-turn cooldown, 60% chance to provoke. So very similar to Fram just now, but 1 turn more on the cooldown, and he has no way to keep that up. And his burst is just 3 cost, attacks all enemies, heals them for damage dealt. Very simplistic. One of the things that he has on there is outdone by a lot of other heroes, like the one we just talked about. Decent attack and alright health and defense. Those stats are not the greatest. He just does not offer very much that anyone else can do immensely better, and he costs a lot of saving to get, so he's just not really worth it in any regard. So he's going to be one of the other few D tiers. Next up is Earth Zaira, another warrior. She's going to cost twice as much as Earth 9 at 300,000 Alliance Raid credits. All of her abilities are going to scale with speed, so she's going to be able to go quick and deal damage still, but also be harder to build properly. Her 1 is going to be a single target 70% defense reduction, which is pretty decent. That's also going to be her counterattack ability. Her 2 is a 3-turn cooldown 70% AoE action gauge reduction of the enemies by 25%. And her burst is just going to be straight damage and healer for the damage dealt. Her divine relic is going to give her a chance to increase her speed upon attacking, but also her refined relic will give her attacks piercing damage, so she has access to that despite not being a striker. Only thing she is missing is max health based damage. Other than that, she is far better than Water 9. She can be used effectively. A bit underwhelming attack, but decent defense, but very underwhelming health. Probably not going to keep up in damage with most other DPSs. She is harder to build, she is very expensive to get, but she can be useful in some scenarios. Not as much late game, she will fall off pretty hard, and her main damage sources are only single target, so not as far down as 9, but not much higher in C tier. On to our last 2, and one of which is going to be in a similar vein to Dark Aslan, but nowhere near as disappointing, is Dark Astrid. To get her, you're going to have to conquer Gallus East Extreme and spend a nice measly 77,777,777 gold. That doesn't take forever to save up at all. Not a good sign. Her cost to acquire is very hefty. However, as a Dark Striker, she has a lot going for her, and she can hit very hard, primarily owing to the fact that her attack gets absurdly high. She has one of the highest attacks in the game at level 70 and Ascension 2. She has a nice high and even 2,000 attack. Even her health gets up to 12,000 and her defense gets up to 1,100. However, without level 70 and Ascensions, those are going to be very low, so like most other Astrids, she is very glass cannony, fragile as heck, but if you want damage, she has got it. Her 1 will give her Leech and Divine Luck, which will give her chances to gain extra turns. Her 2 will give her Berserk and reduce the target's action gauge by half. Berserk will give her increased defense and attack, so she hits even harder, and it's a 3-turn cooldown. All of this is single target, of course, because it's Astrid, so that's one of her downsides. She has no AoE. Her burst costs a low 2 spirit gauge, does a hefty amount of damage, and increases her attack power by 30%, stacking up to 3 times. and that will last until the end of the wave. So despite the fact that she does not have max HP based damage, the just sheer amounts of attack she gets from all of her sources and her base attack makes her hit very, very hard. She is one of the strongest single target dark DPSs in the game. Her main drawback is her cost. She does sometimes get a little outclassed by Dark Buryu because he's a bit more durable and has max HP based damage, but she can hold her own just fine and you will not be disappointed with her. You just need to make sure she is shielded and defensed up and invincible occasionally because she is very breakable. But apart from all that, very satisfying, very effective damage unit in S tier. And last but not least, our very own Citadel Assistant and Chronicle Access, Light Mew. She is going to be a bit of a weird one. She is a light cleric, a very good cleric, but acquiring her, you're going to have to go through all 10 of the contracts, the heroes of which we will get to in the next tier list video. It'll be a lot shorter because there's a lot fewer of them. But once you do that, you have to do this thing called the 1,000-day contract, in which in 1,000 days you will be handed Mew for free. However, there are lots of things you can do to reduce the number of days it takes significantly, like conquering entire difficulty modes of the campaign, doing things in the Silent Straits, and other content. So it is definitely not going to be an actual 1,000 days, upon which you will receive instantly a fully Ascension 2 Light Mew. She does not have an Unascended or Ascension 1, which is one drawback because she only has one outfit, unlike every other hero that has 3 by default. So that's a little bit sad. As a cleric, she's going to have pretty hefty defense and very, very hefty health, and that is very helpful with the synergy she has with her abilities. Her 1 is going to be a basic single target, 90% chance to reduce their attack power for 2 turns. A good little debuff, far better than some of the other clerics like Fire Vanessa. Her 2 is going to be a 2-turn cooldown, so every other turn attacks all enemies and increases everyone's on your team's defense for 2 turns and heals them based on her max health, which is going to be very high. And then in a similar vein to Water Vanessa, her burst is going to be a 3-cost burst, which reduces all enemies' action gauges by 20%, revives all allies, heals them based on her max health, and then grants them a damage resistance buff for 2 turns. So another team-wide resurrection with a little bit of a different effect than Water Vanessa, in that it gives damage reduction to help them survive afterwards, which Vanessa sometimes struggles a little bit with. Overall, her main drawback is that she can take a little bit of time to acquire. Other than that, you're going to have a very effective healer on your team who can resurrect and provide solid buffs and a little bit of debuffs to the enemy, and all you really need to do is build health on her and a little bit of speed. So she's going to go right up here as well to S tier. And that is going to conclude the very first Lord of Heroes hero tier list here on Nyris Gaming for all of the heroes that you can get as a free-to-play player without going into the summon system, or any of the ones that were paid only before that are not accessible currently, or aren't contract heroes, which will be the next tier list. Thank you all for watching. Like if you liked, share your comments and opinions down in the comments, and subscribe if you would like to see more in the future. I will be doing a few streams with my friend Deathwalker like we have been, likely doing Helldivers 2, and I will be attempting to get into the Tomb Raider remasters in the near future, because I have never played classic Tomb Raider. Weird, I know, as a fiction lover and a gamer. There's a lot of classic things I haven't played yet that I would like to play on the channel, so until all of that, I will see you in the next video.